because they really are very distinctly different.
Yeah.
The ones that are subtle, the traditionals that don't have anything else in them, like the star thistle, I
love that. I made a great traditional out of that.
I didn't know what to expect from it. Like, I tasted the honey, and I'm like, wow, this is really interesting, because it's very pungent. And I was like, okay, this is going to be real interesting. Not as pungent and not as needing of age as heather mead, but certainly quite aromatic. And I just won a medal for it. And one of the judges, who I of course I find out later happens to be a local friend of mine that had traveled down for the competition. She's like, man, that is one of the best meads I ever had. She goes, what's in it? I said, nothing. It's nothing. That's the
honey,
that's
water, and yeast, dude.
Yeah, she said that right there is a perfect example of, you more from less.
Yeah.
It didn't need anything else. It just happened to be, a really beautiful expression of that honey. She goes, it's a honey I had never had before, so I didn't really know, whether there was something else going on there. And I think those meads. Yeah, and you can't make a mead like that out of every honey necessarily.
No, some don't do well as they need something else with them,
Buckwheat.
Eastern buckwheat. Western, maybe not so much. I've had Western buckwheat, single varietal traditionals, and they were fine.
Yeah, and I've never had that experience with buckwheat honey where everybody says, horse blanket and barnyard and that sort of thing. So
it's like the big game, the locker room after the big game in the championship round.
And I must be using the wrong kind. I've had lighter honeys. I've had darker buckwheat honeys for whatever reason. Either what I'm doing to them, like I did a buckwheat sizer last year that ended up.
That'd be nice.
I mean, it was like a baked apple pie. It was ridiculous.
Well, I say buckwheat and a sizer is a perfect combination, a perfect place to put buckwheat because it would go so well with apple. Buckwheat tastes like fall. Unfortunately, a lot of the buckwheat tastes like fall, along with the horse poo that you're, composting for the winter. But it's got a little too much fall in it, But rotting leaves and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think buckwheat would pair really well in something like that. In a sizer, it's the best place or a good place for it.
Is that the sleigh ride where you're right next to the horse's ass?
So that's the one,
The full fall experience, okay.
Where if he's going a little too fast, the horse apples might actually come into the sleigh. Yeah, that one. That's
exactly.
the one.
They're hitting you in the back of the head.
Yeah, pretty much.
So another one that I've done with buckwheat a couple of times is dried currants. So you get the raisiny, kind of
dried currants.
Yeah, dried currants. So just kind of chop them up real quick to make sure that they've got an open edge to insides, and just chuck them in a straining bag. I'll let it ferment for 4 or 5 days before I do that, just because I want the yeast to really get going, and just drop those a bag of dried currants in there and just let them go until they're pretty mushy, and you can taste it. You can, within a couple of days, you take a quick sample of that, you can taste the dried currants in it. It is, in some ways, to me, it feels like somebody must have done this in history with mead, and this is probably one of the ones that people talked about because it has an elegance about it, and it's more than just the buckwheat honey and the currants. Like it's big and it's bold. Meaning I usually make it fairly hot and strong, so it'll be like 15-16% alcohol.
Whoa.
Pretty sweet still,
yeah.
And you've got this really intense, dried currant flavor, and then the buckwheat honey,
I like the idea of that with that drying, because currants, I only like currants in certain situations. Most of the time they don't do much for me, but I've had a few currant meads that were pretty darn good. Well, a couple of them won medals in the Mazer Cup last year, but the idea of them with the buckwheat is actually fairly intriguing, and dried as opposed to the fresh.
Right.
That's really neat.
And typically I'll do, and so those are going to be dried red currants.
Okay.
Dried black currants are harder to find, and those are going to be different. That would be a very different profile. And I love currant, but if I was going to use black currant, I'd probably use a black currant concentrate or fresh black currants if I could get them, which are extremely difficult to find in the States. But the dried red currants, because they're much more like a raisin, they've got a milder a milder flavor. Yeah, the first time I did it, it tasted like a granola bar when it was done.
Oh my!
It
Oh
was
my
red.
gosh!
What's really weird about it is the currants were in there long enough that the pigment from the dried red currants, which they don't look red, they look like a golden raisin. They didn't look red to me, but it was actually reddish in color by the time it was done fermenting. Yeah, it tasted like a chewy, like nut and raisin granola bar. It was crazy. So
Oh, that sounds really. I like the sound of that. I love granola bars.
Red currant's one of my favorite wines.
Yeah, and it's this newer one that I just did. It's been a year ago. It's more rustic. It has more of a less of the raisiny, fruity character to it, and more the buckwheat's definitely driving it a lot more. It's got more of that oat and earth aspects to it. Again, no less good. It's just quite different, which tells you that the buckwheat honey, two different sources. One was dark, one was light. You're gonna get two completely different results out of it. Because it's you put those two honeys next to each other. Other than the way they smelled, you wouldn't necessarily guess they were from the same plant, essentially, at all. So,
do you have like a top three that you find yourself making over and over again?
That's probably the idea of making recipes over and over again is probably one of the big things I'm going to look back on. I'm not sure how I'm going to look back on it, though, because I on the one hand, you could say I look back and regret not doing it enough because I don't actually make recipes all that frequently, maybe twice, and I'll move on to something else. Some people are probably going to think when they're hearing this, oh, and you're trying to go commercial, interesting, so you think you're going to be able to be consistent about it. Well, I'm not really sure, but I'm also not planning on, like I said, I'm going to have a rotating lineup, so consistency might not be the one variable I'm going to focus on. Consistency in my overall process. I do make a lot of sizers just because we're in apple country here, so I just got 40 gallons of cider 2 weekends ago, and we've got 11 gallons of sizer going.
Well, I mean, you did say you would let the people tell you what it.
True.
Yep. I guess you are being consistent.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly am. And I focus more on the process. Like, I focus more on sitting down and, okay, I'm going to design a recipe. Here's what I have for ingredients. Here's what I know about them. Like, I want to know what's the sugar content in them. What do I have for quantities? Try to work out what does a recipe, like, where am I starting with my gravity? Okay, what yeast am I using? Where do I think I'm going to end up gravity-wise? I mean, one of the trends that I can tell you I'm seeing in the last, say, 12 months is I'm dropping my starting gravities. I don't want as much alcohol because it takes too damn long for it to mellow out. It's just, it's harsh. And to me...
When you say not too much alcohol, what sort of percentage are you talking there?
I mean, I'm migrating down from 14.5 to 12.5 to 13. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it's enough that I think I'm taking 1 to 3 months off the aging time. And for a commercial operation, it's a big deal because that's your inventory turnaround is going to be a little bit quicker. On the session mead side, where the ABV is going to be 6 to 7, maybe up to 8.5%, you have a much different problem because you don't necessarily have alcohol that's dictating when stuff is ready. It's more that you've got to get your product cleared and get it into your bright tank so you can get it carbonated. So you get a slightly different process. But for the dessert meads, I know I used to say, okay, I'm going to build a recipe right up to the alcohol tolerance of the yeast. That way, I can safely use sulfite and sorbate to stabilize it. I can back sweeten if I need to. Maybe I won't, depending on what I do. And it worked, but some of those had to sit in the basement for 6 to 12 months before I really felt like I couldn't pick up the alcohol so much that they were enjoyable. Now that I'm down to 12.5 or 13%, or maybe a little lower, and I'm back sweet. I am adding a little bit of of honey back in to give it just enough sweetness for everything to come together, I'm feeling like those are drinkable in 2 to 3 months, sometimes even quicker. And I'm enjoying them just as much. So for me, it feels like the product tastes better. It feels like it's more well made because I'm not sitting there waiting for a flaw essentially to age out.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and professionally,
how are you doing your back sweetening?
So a couple different things. I mean, I've used different products depending on what the actual flavor profile of it is. I found, oddly enough, agave nectar for coffee meads to back sweeten there. The sweetness with the agave seems to be a really nice pairing with the coffee flavor in the mead. Melomels, I'll probably add some honey. I'm adding enough that it's bumping the sweetness up, but I'm also not adding so much that you actually get a raw honey taste out of it. Which again, you give it a month or two of age, it'll come into balance with the rest of the flavors. So if you got a fairly bold melomel and you're adding, say you got 6 gallons and you're adding, let me just do a quick calculation here so I'm not talking out of my ass. I would do that, but it might not help anybody, and I'd rather actually try to help somebody by giving them a real number that I might use. So say you got 6 gallons, and it's sitting at 10-10, and you want it to be about 10-20. So for 6 gallons, you're going to have to add 1.25 pounds of honey. And what I'd probably do is just enough hot water to liquefy that honey, and I would dump it right in the carboy, mix it up. This is after I've stabilized it, but before I've added a clarifier, if I'm going to do that. And if I'm going to back sweeten with honey, I'm always going to add a clarifier because honey will make it cloudy again. And, add that in there, let it sit for a few days as long as I don't see any fermentation or anything undesired. Hit it with a clarifier, give it a week or so. It's nice and clear. I'm at my target sweetness. And at that point, I can really manage my alcohol. Like I could go down to 9 or 10%. And still back sweeten to 10-20, maybe a little less depending on what else is in it. And I have a finished product, but I also have one that the alcohol's not standing out. It's not jumping out going, hey, look at me. It's there. It's pleasant already. I mean, that might be saleable in 45 days.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
45 days is pretty good. Are you, what are your thoughts on filtering from a professional standpoint?
I definitely think I will, because I believe that the two-prong approach of filtering and also using stabilization additives. I know there's a lot of folks out there that, commercial folks that have had the experience where they've still had bottle re-fermentation, and, I know that's a worry that I'm going to have, but I think if you filter stabilization additives, and especially with your stronger meads, if you're letting them sit around for a couple of months, you can kind of keep an eye on them.
Mm-hmm.
With the session meads, the filtration and being able to get them stable pretty quickly, so that I can get them clarified and into a bright tank is going to be pretty important. My trials that I've been doing at home here, I've actually not run into any issues. The only time I ran into a re-fermentation issue is I didn't cold crash and get the mead off of the yeast cake.
Yeah.
And stabilization additives, of course, just don't work as effectively because the yeast load that's left in that carboy is much higher. So it's really a matter of making sure you're just racking off the yeast cake before you try to stabilize it. But if you're dry, if you got something that's dry, you can get that stabilized within a couple of days. You'll know whether it's stable. So filtration will help with the gross clarification. You stabilize to really make sure that you can add additional sugar, whether it be fruit or maple syrup or who knows what, for flavoring, and that you're not going to get re-fermentation. And then you can, move that along to whatever the next step is. So we know we'll do it. Just don't necessarily know to what degree, how big of a filtration apparatus are we going to have, especially if we're going to use stabilization additives. To some degree, you don't have to do a sterile filtration at that point. because you're hoping that you're kind of doing a combination of both.